The sirens cut through the early morning silence, flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the neat rows of houses in Crestwood, Ohio, on the morning of April 12, 2023. It wasn't the kind of place where police responded to violent crimes. Yet here they were, 3 patrol cars pulling up to the modest brick house on Maplewood Drive, followed closely by a crime scene unit. Inside, the air smelled of fresh coffee and lavender-scented candles. The kitchen was spotless, the breakfast table neatly set for one. Nora Christensen sat at the head of it, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, her fingers completely still. A radio played softly in the background, a cheerful voice reading off the morning's weather report. She barely glanced up as the officers stepped inside, the lead detective taking in the scene with a practiced eye. Nothing about the room suggested chaos or panic. Nothing hinted at the horror waiting down the hall. The call had come in 20 minutes ago. A woman's voice, controlled but oddly detached. She had spoken only 8 words before hanging up. "You'll find him in the bedroom. He's dead." A week earlier, Hunter Marsh's life had looked, at least from the outside, like a picture of stability. At 45, he was the senior guidance counselor at Crestwood High, a man known for his easy demeanor and steady presence. Parents trusted him with their troubled teens. Students sought him out for advice on college applications and family problems. Faculty saw him as someone who could smooth over conflicts without taking sides. He was the kind of man people described as dependable, solid. But solid things can crack. Beneath the image, Hunter carried the quiet weight of routine dissatisfaction. His marriage, though intact, had dulled into something functional rather than fulfilling. His children, both in college, no longer needed him in the way they once had. At work, he was respected, even liked, but never the center of attention. He wasn't the charismatic teacher students remembered years later. He wasn't the beloved coach or the administrator with grand ambitions. He was just there, necessary but unrehuntable. And then there was Nora Christensen. Nora, 38, had joined the faculty 7 years earlier, teaching English with an intensity that made students either love her or resent her. She was sharp, engaging, and occasionally too familiar in the way she connected with her class. Whispers had followed her from her previous school. Nothing concrete, just murmurs of unprofessional conduct, a too-close relationship with a male colleague. But nothing had ever been proven, and Crestwood, eager to fill a long vacant position, had given her a chance. In the beginning, she kept a professional distance from her coworkers. She was pleasant but not overly social, efficient but not particularly warm. Then, gradually, things shifted. A drink after work here, a slightly too personal conversation there. By the time she and Hunter began gravitating toward one another, no one thought much of it. After all, Hunter was the safe kind, the married kind, the kind who wouldn't cross lines. Nora's home life was no secret. Her marriage to David Christensen, a former Marine turned logistics manager, was visibly strained. Colleagues had seen the bruises on her wrist once, the way she had flinched when her phone rang unexpectedly. But Nora never spoke about it, never confirmed what some had suspected. Instead, she buried herself in work, in casual flirtations, in late nights grading papers long after the hallways had emptied. And then there was Hunter. It had started with something small, a lingering conversation after a staff meeting, a shared joke that felt more personal than it should have. Then there were the excuses to spend more time together, collaborating on student cases, meetings that didn't need to happen. No one paid attention when they sat too close at school functions. When Hunter's wife called during one of their late-night planning sessions, and he sent the call to voicemail, Nora had smiled. That was the moment the balance shifted. A text message at 11:42 p.m. A meaningless phrase, but one that felt heavier than it should have been. Still awake? Hunter had stared at it for too long before responding. Yeah. You? The response came immediately. Couldn't sleep. Thinking too much. He should have stopped there. But he didn't. About what? These were the moments people missed, the ones that mattered. At school, Nora played her role well. Professional, polished, composed. But when she looked at Hunter, something flickered behind her carefully controlled expression. Not love. Not attraction. Something closer to calculation. She saw in him what she needed. An escape. A distraction. a game that she was sure she could win. Hunter, for all his supposed steadiness, had no idea he had already lost. By the time the first rumor surfaced, it was too late. A senior had mentioned seeing them together after hours. A janitor had found Nora alone in Hunter's office more than once, her chair suspiciously close to his desk. The whispers were soft at first, easy to ignore. But rumors had a way of growing, of spreading like cracks in glass. Hunter told himself they were being careful. He convinced himself no one truly suspected anything. Nora, on the other hand, didn't seem to care. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the quiet tension, the risk that came with stolen glances and secret texts. The late nights continued. The boundaries blurred. The affair had started like most do, with denial and rationalization. But eventually, Hunter stopped making excuses. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. Now, in the early morning light, with police swarming her home, Nora Christensen sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee. Somewhere in the house, officers were stepping over Hunter Marsh's body. She stared down at the swirling liquid in her mug. It was still warm. She had known the call would bring them here. She had been waiting. Hunter Marsh had built a life that, on the surface, appeared steady. A respected career, a stable marriage, 2 children away at college, a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He played the role of the responsible husband, the caring father, the trusted guidance counselor. He gave advice on colleges, calmed anxious students, mediated between teachers and parents. At work, he was patient, dependable, and always in control. At home, it was different. His marriage to Emily had settled into something that resembled comfort more than love. They rarely argued, but they rarely talked either. Not in the way they used to. Conversations revolved around practical matters, bank statements, home maintenance, how their son was adjusting to his freshman year. The warmth had faded years ago, and in its place was a quiet, polite detachment. They slept in the same bed but never touched. Dinners were routine, filled with background noise from the television instead of laughter. Emily trusted him. She never questioned the late nights at work, the school events that stretched long after the last student had gone home. She believed in the man he had once been, the man he still pretended to be. But Hunter wasn't sure if that man existed anymore. Nora Christensen's marriage had its own fractures, but hers were harder to hide. The tension clung to her like perfume, noticeable even when she smiled. She wore long sleeves, even in warm weather. Some of the faculty whispered about the times she had come to work looking exhausted, about the way her husband, David, hovered at school functions but never spoke much. No one knew the details, only the hints. The stiffness in her shoulders, the way she sometimes stared blankly at her computer screen, lost in thought. She never complained, never spoke about her home life beyond vague mentions of stress. When she did, it was always framed carefully, as if revealing just enough to earn sympathy but not enough to invite intervention. She was magnetic in a way Hunter hadn't expected. Not necessarily beautiful in the traditional sense, but striking, sharp-witted, confident, with a presence that pulled people in. Students admired her intensity, the way she challenged them. Teachers either loved her or found her exhausting. Hunter had first noticed her in small ways. The way she tilted her head when she listened. How her eyes lingered just a second too long when they spoke. There was something familiar in her frustration, something that mirrored his own. It was inevitable that they would end up alone together one night. It had started as nothing. A school event that ran late. A handful of teachers still lingering in the staff lounge. The hum of vending machines filling the silence. One by one, the others trickled out, leaving just the 2 of them. Hunter should have left. He had no real reason to stay. But Nora looked tired in a way that made him pause. He asked if she was okay. She laughed, shaking her head, brushing it off. Then she sighed. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore," she admitted. He understood that feeling more than he wanted to. The conversation stretched longer than it should have. At first, it was about work, students, lesson plans, school politics. Then it wasn't. It was about regret, about what they thought life would look like by now. Hunter didn't remember who moved first. Maybe it was her. Maybe it was him. A touch, a breath, a moment that crossed a line neither of them had acknowledged until it was too late. They didn't talk about it the next day, or the day after that, but something had shifted. A week later, Nora texted him late at night. It was short, nothing explicit, just a message that made it clear she was thinking about him. He should have ignored it, but he didn't. The affair started slowly, cautiously. Glances in hallways, small touches when no one was looking. The thrill of getting away with something. Hunter told himself it didn't mean anything, that it was just an escape. Something harmless that he could stop if he really wanted to. Nora didn't seem to see it that way. She was careful at first, always waiting for him to initiate. But as the weeks passed, she grew bolder. She pushed limits, tested his hesitations. She whispered things to him in empty classrooms, ran her fingers over his wrist just before walking away. Hunter told himself he was still in control. Nora knew otherwise. There was a shift in her behavior, subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't just having an affair. She was orchestrating it. The late-night messages turned into demands. If he didn't respond quickly enough, she would send another, then another. She needed to know where he was, what he was doing. If he seemed distant, she would accuse him of regretting it, of using her. She played on his guilt expertly, making it seem like she was the one being taken advantage of. At home, Hunter found himself distracted. He checked his phone too often. He felt restless, irritated at things that had never bothered him before. Emily noticed. She asked if everything was okay, if work was stressing him out. He lied. Nora's moods became unpredictable. Some days, she was playful, teasing him, pulling him deeper into the secrecy. Other times, she was cold, withdrawn, making him feel like he had done something wrong. He started to wonder if she had been like this before him, or if he was the one unraveling her. One evening, after another long night together, Hunter told her they should slow down. She didn't take it well. "You don't get to decide that," she said quietly. It was the first time he felt real unease. He should have ended it then, but he didn't. Because the truth was, despite the warning signs, despite the way Nora was tightening her grip around him, he liked the way she made him feel. Wanted. Important. Necessary. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The affair was no longer a carefully contained secret. It had become a living, breathing thing, unpredictable and consuming. The stolen moments that once felt thrilling turned reckless. Hunter knew it. Nora didn't care. She had stopped being cautious. She started calling him during school hours, sending messages that left no room for misinterpretation. She would find excuses to pull him into empty classrooms, touching him in ways that made it obvious what they were doing. He tried to remind her that people were watching, but she only smiled, as if daring them to notice. Hunter had never been a liar, not really. Now, he lied without hesitation. To his wife, to his coworkers, to himself. He stayed late at school for reasons that didn't exist, missed dinners at home, ignored phone calls from Emily when he was with Nora. The first time he told his wife he was on a school retreat when he was really in a hotel with Nora, he felt sick with guilt. By the third time, it barely registered. Red flags began to appear, small but unmistakable. A senior student lingered outside the staff lounge one evening, watching as Nora walked out moments after Hunter, their movements too synchronized, too familiar. A history teacher mentioned in passing that Hunter had been hard to find lately, half joking about how he seemed to disappear between classes. Nora's husband, David, began showing up unannounced at school, waiting for her in the parking lot, watching from his car. Hunter saw him once through the window, his face unreadable, his posture rigid. That was the moment Hunter realized that Nora had never been fully honest about her marriage. She had painted herself as the victim, but she had never said she wanted to leave. She had never acted like a woman planning to escape. If anything, she seemed to be playing both sides, stringing Hunter along while keeping her husband exactly where she wanted him. He tried to slow things down. Nora made that impossible. She didn't handle distance well. The first time he ignored one of her texts, she left a note on his desk, a small slip of paper folded neatly inside his appointment book. She had written only 2 words, "Not yet." He pretended not to know what it meant. The next time he tried to put space between them, she let herself into his office during his lunch break, closed the door, and stared at him without speaking. The silence stretched too long before she finally leaned over his desk, her fingers tracing the edge of his notepad. "I don't like being ignored." Her voice was soft, but there was something underneath it, something final. Hunter started to regret everything. Nora became erratic. One moment, she was affectionate, sending him messages filled with warmth, with promises, with memories of nights they had spent together. The next, she was furious, accusing him of avoiding her, of using her, of planning to throw her away when he got bored. He was exhausted. He barely slept, constantly on edge, checking his phone for new messages even when he told himself he wouldn't. He started snapping at students, making careless mistakes, misplacing paperwork. He caught his reflection in his office window one afternoon and barely recognized himself. Emily noticed. One night at dinner, she put down her fork, looking at him for longer than he was comfortable with. "You're different," she said. Hunter forced a smile. "Long week." She kept watching him, as if she could see through his skin, through the excuses. Nora's husband was watching, too. One evening, as Hunter was leaving school, he saw David waiting in the parking lot again. This time, he wasn't sitting in his car. He was leaning against it, arms crossed, his gaze locked onto Hunter as he walked past. For a moment, Hunter considered stopping, saying something. But what was there to say? He had slept with another man's wife. He had made a mistake that was growing larger by the day. Nora had assured him David knew nothing, but Hunter wasn't sure he believed her anymore. Nora was unraveling. He saw it in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke, the way her mood shifted without warning. It was no longer just an affair to her. It was something else, something more dangerous. She didn't want him to love her. She wanted to own him. And Hunter was beginning to fear what would happen if he tried to break free. Hunter had always been a man of control. He had built a life on restraint, on predictability, on careful decisions. He had spent years advising troubled students on how to avoid mistakes, how to take responsibility, how to steer their lives back on track before things went too far. He had never imagined that one day he would be the one in need of that advice. The affair had been a mistake from the beginning, but now it had become something else, something dangerous. He had tried to manage it, tried to end it quietly before it unraveled completely, but Nora was not the type to accept rejection. He had rehearsed the words in his head for days before he finally confronted her. He told himself that if he approached it carefully, if he gave her space, she would move on. He told himself she would understand. He had underestimated her. She stood across from him in the empty classroom, arms folded, her face calm but unreadable. He had chosen the location on purpose, hoping the familiarity of the school setting would keep the conversation grounded, professional. A place where things like this weren't supposed to happen. Nora barely reacted when he told her it was over. No shock, no sadness, no anger. She just watched him, as if waiting for him to realize something. When he repeated himself, she finally exhaled, almost amused. "You think you can just stop?" she asked. Hunter felt something shift in the air. He had expected emotion, an argument, maybe even tears. But there was none of that. Just quiet certainty. He explained the risks, the rumors, the fact that people were beginning to notice. He told her it had gone too far, that they had both been reckless, that he couldn't do it anymore. Nora tilted her head slightly, considering his words as if they were irrelevant to her. She stepped closer, too close, forcing him to hold his ground. Her eyes never left his. "People always talk," she said, "but they only believe what they can prove." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. It was thick, heavier than he expected when she placed it in his hands. He hesitated before opening it, already knowing it was something bad. Inside were photos. Dozens of them. Hunter's breath caught in his throat. Him and Nora in his car. Leaving a motel. Talking too close in the parking lot. Some were grainy, taken from a distance. Others were crystal clear, sharp enough to remove any doubt about what they were seeing. His first instinct was disbelief. How long had she been planning this? Nora leaned in, lowering her voice. "You should be careful who you disappoint." Hunter gripped the photos, his knuckles white. He wanted to ask who had taken them, why she had them, what she planned to do. But he already knew the answer. She had been waiting for this moment. That night, a note appeared in his mailbox. No envelope, no name. Just a plain piece of paper folded in half. 5 words, typed neatly, centered on the page. Do you think she's worth it? The words settled over him like a noose. Hunter stepped onto his porch, scanning the quiet suburban street. The houses were dark, the sidewalks empty. A cold breeze moved through the trees, rustling the leaves, but there was nothing else. No car idling nearby. No shadow lingering at the edge of the yard. He turned and went inside, locking the door behind him. At school, a student approached him between classes. A senior, one of Nora's favorites. A quiet girl, smart but observant. She talks about you, the girl said. Hunter stiffened. She talks about you like she knows something no one else does. Her voice was hesitant, like she wasn't sure she should be telling him this. He tried to keep his face neutral, but the unease had already settled deep in his gut. Nora had never been reckless with her words before. If she was talking, it meant she wanted people to know. And that meant she was no longer keeping secrets. The threats came in small, carefully placed moments. Never direct, never obvious. Just casual re-hunters, spoken too smoothly to be coincidences. Rumors spread quickly. People love a scandal. It's funny how fast a career can end. Some men are so easy to destroy. She never looked at him when she said them, never acknowledged them as threats, but Hunter understood. He ignored her as much as he could, but Nora made that impossible. She showed up in places she had no reason to be. His office, the break room, the hallway outside his classroom. She waited for him by his car after school. She never said anything, just stood there, watching. Then came the envelope. It was left on his desk in his locked office. No note, no explanation. Hunter didn't want to open it. Inside were more photos. The same ones she had shown him before, but this time, there were extras. A picture of him entering his own home. A shot of Emily in their driveway. His son at college, laughing with friends. The message was clear. Nora was no longer just threatening him. She was making sure he knew just how much she had been watching. For the first time, Hunter truly felt afraid. That evening, he waited in the parking lot until most of the other faculty had left. When he finally walked to his car, Nora was already there, leaning against it, arms crossed. She wasn't smiling this time. He told her it was over. Not just the affair. Everything. The texts, the conversations, the stolen moments. He told her she needed to leave him alone. Nora stared at him, her expression unreadable. You don't mean that, she said. Hunter kept his voice firm, his stance steady. He told her again. Nora sighed, tilting her head, watching him like she was seeing something he couldn't. You think you get to decide that? She took a slow step closer. He held his ground. She studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly to herself, as if reaching a decision. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She never looked back. Nora Christensen had always believed she was in control. Of her job, of her marriage, of the men who drifted into her orbit. Hunter Marsh had been no different, just another predictable man searching for something outside his routine. She had known what to say, how to make him feel wanted, how to keep him close. And for a while, it had worked. But now, everything was slipping. Hunter was pulling away, retreating back into his neat little life, acting as if she had been a mistake he could erase. He avoided her, ignored her messages, refused to acknowledge her in the hallways, as if she had never existed. At first, Nora had told herself it was temporary. He would come back. He always had before. But the days stretched into weeks, and something inside her began to shift. The text she sent went unanswered. When she confronted him in the parking lot, his voice was cold, final. He was done. Nora had never handled rejection well. The rage came first, sharp and consuming. The thought of him going home to his wife, pretending he was still the same man, disgusted her. He had been in her bed, in her world, had whispered to her about how empty his life had become. And now, he expected to return to that life and shut her out like she was nothing? No. Then came the heartbreak, the deep ache that made her feel hollow. She had let herself believe, for just a moment, that Hunter was different, that he saw her, that he needed her as much as she needed him. But in the end, he was just like the rest. Weak, She thought of David, her husband, the way he had made her feel small for years, how she had spent a decade smiling through gritted teeth, letting people believe she had a stable home, a loving partner. It had all been a lie. Hunter had been her escape, and now he was taking that away from her too. The more she thought about it, the clearer the answer became. Hunter wasn't just rejecting her. He was ruining her. He had destroyed what little control she had left, had made her reckless, had made her take risks she never would have before. And now, he was walking away, leaving her to deal with the consequences. She had always been careful, always thought 5 steps ahead. If Hunter's fate was sealed, then she needed a plan. A way to walk away untouched. She began to prepare. At home, she started researching obsessively. Late at night, she pored over crime reports, watched true crime documentaries, read articles about unsolved cases. She took notes. What mistakes did people make? What details led investigators to the truth? What stories fell apart under scrutiny? She tested excuses in casual conversation, weaving them into staff meetings, throwing out hypothetical scenarios. It's strange how people can just snap, she mused one afternoon in the teacher's lounge, like when students feel pushed too far. You hear about those cases where no one saw it coming. Most people didn't react, distracted by their lunch breaks, but one teacher nodded absently. Yeah, there's always signs though. You just have to look close enough. Nora filed that away. If Hunter was going to die, she needed a convenient suspect, someone unpredictable, someone troubled, someone people would believe was capable of violence. She already had the perfect candidate. Dylan Christensen had been a problem student for years. No relation to her, but she had always found it ironic they shared a last name. He was angry, impulsive, always on the edge of expulsion. Teachers whispered about him in the lounge, speculating about what went on at home. He had been in fights, had been suspended multiple times, had even been caught once with a knife in his backpack. Nora started planting seeds. During staff meetings, she casually mentioned his recent outbursts, how he had become even more erratic. She expressed concern about his temper, his fixation on certain teachers. I hate to say it, but he makes me nervous, she told the school secretary one afternoon, lowering her voice just enough to sound genuine. He's so unpredictable. A few days later, she left a fake note on her own desk, written in shaky, uneven handwriting. A vague threat, something about people at this school paying for what they've done. She discovered it during her lunch break, brought it to administration, let them assume what they wanted. When asked who might have written it, she hesitated, as if she didn't want to say. Eventually, she let Dylan's name slip. The idea took root quickly. People already distrusted him. All they needed was a little push. Nora didn't rush the next step. She was methodical, careful. Hunter was a creature of habit. She knew his schedule, his routines. She knew where he parked, what time he left, what routes he took home. She just had to wait for the right moment. The night before she planned to kill him, she went home and sat across from David at the dinner table. He barely looked at her, barely spoke. He never asked where she had been or why she had been coming home late. She realized then that if she disappeared tomorrow, if she never walked through that front door again, he wouldn't even notice. She had spent so many years living in the shadows of other people's lives. Hunter had been her chance to break free. He had taken that away. Hunter Marsh hadn't been himself in weeks. The stress was eating away at him, affecting everything. His work, his home life, even the way he carried himself. His colleagues noticed. His wife noticed. The easy confidence he once had was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that never seemed to leave him. Nora had stopped reaching out. That should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The silence felt worse. It meant she was planning something. Then his keys went missing. He had reached for them at the end of the school day, expecting them to be in their usual spot in his desk drawer. They weren't. He searched the entire office. Every drawer, every surface, even the pockets of his coat. Nothing. His appointment book was gone, too. So was his spare ID badge. Nora had been in his office. He locked the door behind him and left the building quickly, checking over his shoulder as he walked to his car. He had a spare key at home, but it didn't matter. The fact that she had taken them at all meant she wasn't done with him yet. That night, he sat across from Emily at the dinner table, barely touching his food. She watched him, waiting. Finally, she sighed. "You're not here," she said. Hunter forced a small smile. "Just work stuff." She studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly and went back to her meal. But he could tell she didn't believe him. He barely slept that night. Every sound in the house made his muscles tense. He got up twice to check the locks, standing by the front window for long stretches, looking out at the quiet street. By morning, he had convinced himself he was overreacting. Nora wasn't going to break into his house. She wasn't going to do anything reckless. She was just trying to scare him. At work, he kept his head down, avoiding conversation. Nora wasn't in her classroom. She wasn't in the hallways. He asked another teacher if she had called in sick, trying to sound casual. The answer didn't help. "She left early yesterday," the teacher said. "Didn't say why." Hunter nodded, forcing himself to act like that wasn't important. But it was. Nora never left early. Something was happening. By lunchtime, his anxiety was at its peak. He sat in his office, hands gripping the desk, staring at the closed door. His stolen ID badge, his keys, his schedule. All of it was out there, in Nora's hands. He had no idea what she was planning, but it wasn't good. The thought hit him suddenly. His car. He shot up from his desk and walked quickly to the parking lot. His car was exactly where he left it. No broken windows, no damage. But something felt wrong. He walked around it slowly, his pulse pounding. The door handles were clean. No scratches. The tires weren't slashed. Then he saw it. The back door was unlocked. His throat tightened. He was sure, absolutely sure. He had locked the entire car the night before. He pulled the door open and looked inside. Everything was as it should be. The seats were clean. Nothing looked stolen or disturbed. But he knew better. Nora had been inside. She was making sure he knew it too. That evening, he left work later than usual. He couldn't focus on anything anymore. Every time he tried to go about his day, his mind circled back to her. Where was she? What was she doing? He thought about going to the police. But what could he say? That an ex-lover had stolen his keys? That he thought she had been inside his car but couldn't prove it? That he felt like something terrible was about to happen, even though there was no evidence of a crime? They wouldn't take him seriously. Nora had planned this well. As he pulled into his driveway, the sky was dark, the air heavy with humidity. He sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to shake the feeling that he was being watched. The house was quiet when he stepped inside. Emily had left a note on the counter. She was out with friends, wouldn't be back until later. Hunter stood in the kitchen, rubbing his face with his hands. His head was pounding. He needed a drink, something to take the edge off. He poured a glass of whiskey and leaned against the counter, staring at nothing. Then he heard it. A soft creak from the hallway. His entire body went still. Slowly, he turned his head toward the noise. The house was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the walls. He took a slow step forward. The floor creaked under his weight. Another step. The hallway was empty. The bedroom door was half open, just as he had left it. The closet door was closed. The bathroom door was closed. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He moved through the house carefully, checking each room, each corner. The doors were locked. The windows were shut. Everything was as it should be. Except it wasn't. Because Nora was out there. Somewhere. And she had already made up her mind about what she was going to do next. Hunter Marsh never made it to work the next morning. At first, no one thought much of it. His neighbors went about their usual routines, completely unaware that something was wrong. His car was still in the driveway, but that wasn't unusual. Maybe he had taken the day off. Maybe he had left earlier than normal. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, people didn't pay much attention to small details. By mid-morning, a coworker tried calling. No answer. Another tried. Straight to voicemail. At noon, Emily Marsh pulled into the driveway. She hadn't expected to be home so early, but an appointment had been canceled. She walked inside, setting her keys down on the kitchen counter, calling out for her husband. No response. It wasn't until she stepped into the hallway and saw the motionless shape at the base of the stairs that she screamed. The paramedics arrived quickly, but there was no need for urgency. Hunter had been there for hours. The official report would later describe it as an accident, a fall, a misstep that led to tragic consequences. There was some evidence of head trauma, but nothing that immediately pointed to foul play. Emily was in shock. The police asked their questions, routine, straightforward. Had Hunter been drinking? Had he mentioned feeling dizzy or unwell? Had he seemed distracted? She barely processed their words. It wasn't until later, after the house had emptied and she was left alone in the silence, that certain details started to trouble her. The front door had been locked. Hunter had been alone. So how did this happen? Nora Christensen already knew the answer. The night before, she had waited. Her car was parked down the street, hidden just enough to go unnoticed. She had checked. Emily was out for the evening. Hunter was home alone. She had his keys. She had let herself in. The house was dimly lit, but she didn't turn on any lights. She moved carefully, each step slow and measured. Hunter was in the kitchen, a glass in his hand, shoulders tense. He hadn't noticed her yet. Nora watched him, standing just beyond his line of sight. She had spent weeks thinking about this moment, about how it would happen, about what needed to be done. And now it was time. She stepped forward. Hunter turned, startled. He barely had time to register her presence before Nora closed the space between them. The next moments happened quickly. A struggle, brief but deliberate. A sharp, forceful movement. A calculated act with no chance for escape. By the time it was over, Hunter was no longer moving. Nora stood over him, breathing heavily, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had done it. The moment she had spent so long preparing for had finally come. But the job wasn't finished. This had to look right. She forced herself to stay calm, to go through the plan exactly as she had rehearsed. She carefully placed the missing items from his office, his keys, his ID, his appointment book, where they would raise questions. Then came the final step. She reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a pocket knife. She had taken it from a troubled student's desk weeks ago, knowing it might come in handy. Now, she pressed it into Hunter's hand, ensuring that when investigators arrived, they would find exactly what they needed to. A late-night altercation. A fall. A student with a history of discipline issues. It wouldn't take much to guide the investigation in the right direction. Nora took a step back, scanning the scene one last time. Everything was in place. She wiped down the doorknob, pulled the door closed behind her, and walked to her car. No one saw her. No one would. The next morning, Nora arrived at school as usual. She moved through the halls, greeting students, exchanging polite small talk with colleagues. She made sure not to look at Hunter's empty office for too long, just enough that someone might notice the pause, the small flicker of sadness in her eyes. By mid-morning, the news had started to spread, first in whispers, then in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Hunter Marsh was dead. The teacher's lounge was filled with speculation. A fall? A medical emergency? Someone mentioned hearing about a break-in in another neighborhood a few weeks ago. Could it have been something like that? Nora didn't add to the conversation. She just listened, nodding at the right moments, letting the others talk. Then, when the timing was perfect, she sighed. "It's awful," she murmured, voice low, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "And after everything he told me about that student, too?" She trailed off, shaking her head, as if she had said too much. That was all it took. By lunchtime, the rumors had changed. No one was talking about an accident anymore. They were talking about the troubled student Hunter had been concerned about. The one with the disciplinary record. The one who had gotten into fights. Nora didn't push the idea. She didn't have to. People did that on their own. By the time the school day ended, the story had taken on a life of its own. Nora left the building with the rest of the staff, walking to her car with the same steady pace as always. She kept her expression neutral, calm. There was nothing to worry about. She had planned this perfectly. Hunter was gone, and no one was looking at her. The investigation started with an obvious suspect. A troubled student, a history of aggression, and now, a crime that fit the pattern. Nora Christensen had done her part well. She had planted the idea subtly, let the rumors grow on their own. When the police began asking questions, the student's name came up over and over. It was enough to justify a closer look. At first, Nora believed she had one. She kept her routine normal, played the role of a shaken colleague, expressed her sadness at Hunter's death, but never too much. She attended the memorial, comforted Emily Marsh, and waited for the case to close. Then, the first crack appeared. The forensic team found inconsistencies. The angle of impact suggested controlled force, not random violence. Then there was the issue of the missing items, his keys, his ID, his appointment book, none of which were found on the student. If it had been a robbery or an act of rage, why take those things? Hunter's digital records raised more questions. In the weeks leading up to his death, his emails and texts showed a pattern of fear. He had mentioned feeling watched. There were half-written messages to his wife that were never sent. Most damning of all, an unsent draft in his email. If anything happens to me, look at Nora. Nora remained composed when detectives first questioned her. She gave them what they expected: shock, concern, cooperation. She stuck to her timeline, saying she had been home that night, alone. No witnesses, but no reason to doubt her either. Then the surveillance footage came in. A camera from a neighbor's house had captured a car parked down the street from Hunter's home that night. Blurry, but the make and model matched Nora's. Another camera at a gas station showed her car in the area when she had claimed to be home. The questions became sharper. The second time they brought her in, her answers weren't as smooth. She repeated herself, backtracked, contradicted minor details. She wasn't under arrest yet, but she knew what was coming. The final blow came from a witness. A janitor at the school stepped forward, saying he had seen Nora in Hunter's office days before his death, late at night, when she shouldn't have been there. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, with everything else, it was enough to break the case open. Nora was arrested in front of the entire faculty. She didn't speak as they cuffed her, didn't resist. She kept her head high, her expression unreadable. Students whispered. Colleagues stared. At trial, the prosecution painted her as manipulative, obsessed with control. The defense tried to argue for passion, a moment of impulse, but the evidence showed planning, calculated moves. Hunter Marsh had never stood a chance. The jury didn't take long. Guilty. Nora Christensen was sentenced to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15.